This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. A Constitution Week interview with University of Baltimore professor Garrett Epps, who talks about anchor babies, originalism, and the legacy of civil rights pioneer Julian Bond. 50 years after the first of the urban riots, expert Andre Shashaty explains the link between government policy and discrimination in housing. And nuclear weapons expert Joe Cirincione, in an interview with Bill Press, updates us on the Iran deal. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Law professor Garrett Epps tells Republicans who are concerned about anchor babies to get on with their lives because the Constitution guarantees citizenship to people born in the United States. And we say hello to Garrett Epps, legal scholar, novelist, journalist, and professor of law and creative writing at the University of Baltimore, also Supreme Court correspondent for The Atlantic Online. Garrett Epps, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me.
You know, there are so many constitutional issues in the political discussion lately. So let's start with the 14th Amendment and something we've been hearing a lot lately, anchor babies. What does it say about citizenship? And did it or did it not, as nativists contend, apply only to former slaves?
It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to their jurisdiction are citizens of the United States. It's not complicated wording. In fact, there's really, we have watched over the last few years the American right invent an entirely new original intent for a provision of the Constitution. And so this ought to give you some, window into the difficulties with their claims of originalism. At the time it was framed, it was clearly understood that it covered the children of all kinds of aliens, whether they were supposed to be in the country or not. And in fact, an earlier draft of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 said all persons of the African race. So that was, at that point, they were just aiming at freed slaves. And, the debate was, no, we don't want that. We are also concerned about the many, many immigrants who've come to the United States, many of whom had fought in the Union Army and so forth. So this is not a complicated question. Are the children of the undocumented in the United States? Yes. Are they subject to our jurisdiction? Yes. If they commit a crime, they can be arrested. So case closed. We really should get on with our lives.
Well, in today's news cycle, good luck with that.
Yes.
I mean, and I assume there's zero chance that it could be repealed or changed.
It really, when people start to mess with the 14th Amendment, a lot of people get nervous. It has been called by Justice Thurgood Marshall and many others, the second Constitution is really the key to our democratic system, and among other things applies the Bill of Rights to the states. So the idea that you could get, 2/3 of the both houses and 3/4 of the states to narrow it in some way that we can't foresee, is fanciful. I think what they can do is spend a lot of time spewing sort of anti-immigrant and racist rhetoric over this subject, which does damage in itself. But the Constitution itself, at least the text, is relatively safe.
Do we as progressives need some amendments? Wouldn't it be dangerous to convene a constitutional convention?
I think one of the stealth operations going on the American right is an attempt to get Congress to call a constitutional convention at which, as their spokesman has said, we can get rid of Obamacare, we can get rid of Roe versus Wade, we can do whatever we want. A constitutional convention would be a moment of tremendous uncertainty and danger in this country. And we have to remember the delegates would be elected in a system where there really are no laws. There are no laws, campaign finance, disclosure, anything governing elections for constitutional delegate. I think we can take for granted that the Koch brothers would be willing to spend, much more than $1 billion to control the elections for the group that would rewrite the Constitution. So I think we should be very wary of these proposals. Now, whether we want to support an amendment, possibly something aimed at Citizens United, that's a different question, because support for an amendment, even if it is not successful, can really shape the discussion. And God knows we need some discussion of campaign finance in the Constitution.
Hear, hear. We're speaking with Garrett Epps, legal scholar, novelist, journalist, professor of law and creative writing at the University of Baltimore. Doesn't the concept of originalism that conservatives and a majority of the Supreme Court subscribe to really apply only to political issues that the right is interested?
I think that actually the originalism, so-called, no longer even commands a majority of the conservatives on the court. The new generation, Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Alito, they're really not very interested in originalist rhetoric. Justice Kennedy obviously does not have much concern for it. If you look at his opinion in the same-sex marriage cases, there is no question that Justice Scalia, Justice Thomas, and some of the Republican appointees on the lower courts always managed to look into the past and discover that the founding fathers exactly mirrored their own political conceptions. It's an absurd enterprise in the end to think that we can somehow go back in history and understand the original intent, or more likely the original public meaning, of broad general phrases. In fact, the framers of the Constitution wrote it in broad general phrases because they wanted later generations to apply it. If they had a specific meaning in mind, they used specific language, so that, for example, the president has to be a natural-born citizen. You can't have a bill of attainder. You can't try people for treason except on the testimony of two witnesses. The specific provisions are easy to read. The general provisions are general because they expected future generations to interpret them.
This is what leaves me scratching my head way too often. When I hear people in political circles, of course, and they're out on campaign trails and they're citing the Constitution as if it is law. And it's not. I mean, it's because otherwise it would just be the law books, right? I mean, it wouldn't. The Constitution is for us to mold for the time that we're in, right? I mean, in part.
Article 6, Section 2 says that this Constitution, laws made in pursuance thereof, and treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. So in the end, the Constitution is the law that we fall back on. And if Congress, mercifully, if Congress or a state decides they're going to violate the Constitution, our courts can say, no, you are subject to it. So when you have clerks refusing to marry same-sex couples, they can be subject to orders. They can even be put in jail. And so in that sense, yes, it is law. But the point is, we are expected to interpret the Constitution, not only in the courts, but in the executive branch. For example, when the Obama administration refused to defend the Defense of Marriage Act in court because they said, we have studied this and we think this discrimination against gays and lesbians is unconstitutional. That was absolutely the way the framers intended and understood the government would proceed. We have to apply the general phrases. We have to apply the broad principles in a way that shapes the law that we live under for today. Justice Scalia likes to say, the Constitution is not a living document. The Constitution is a dead document. Well, that's really not the question. The question is this a living nation or a dead country? And the attempt to put the United States under some sort of bell jar and preserve it like a butterfly is really frightening and misguided.
Is there a constitutional solution to legislative gridlock?
Well, you know, in the larger sense, yes, which is for us to go out and use our right to vote and get rid of these bums. To some extent, the court has contributed to the problem of gridlock, and it seems perhaps as if they're reconsidering that support. But in the last term of court, they held that the citizens of Arizona, by initiative, could do away with partisan gerrymandering, could instruct, could shape their government so that the congressional districts are drawn by an independent commission that is bipartisan, so that there won't be gerrymandering, there won't be creation of these safe Republican seats, which they've been very assiduous in doing in 40 of the states since 2010. And so there will be genuine elections for members of the House. If members of the House and Senate have to face real competition at the polls, you will see much more concern on their part, A, for what the people think, and B, for actually making the government run.
It's interesting because it seems to really be taking a long time for that to catch on, and it concerns me that the electorate's not more involved and move, because there are a lot of people that I look at right now, and I'm not going to name the names necessarily because it's my opinion, but that they need to go. They need to be out of office, and we need to get somebody else into these positions to start making decisions that are for the people, not for the next election cycle.
Well, that's absolutely true. The other thing we must do is find ways to tame the flood of special interest money that is simply, you know, it's turned our political system in 2015 is the equivalent of New Orleans after the levee broke. We are just underwater with dirty, dark money that, you know, is already getting and will continue to get favors and responsiveness from elected officials that ordinary citizens can't even dream of. And this, in fact, has even been endorsed explicitly by the conservative majority of the court, who said, you know, this is democracy. The whole point of giving money is to get members of Congress to do your bidding, and that is fine. That's the way it should be. It's kind of shocking, you know. Well, what is shocking in a system historically is usually not law-breaking, but what's legal. And in this system, I mean, I think a century from now, if America survives, children will say to their parents, is it really true that in the 21st century you could go to a politician and write him a check? How could that be? We have to get to that point, and it's going to be quite a constitutional struggle with this court and this Congress and the political system that we currently have.
And I wouldn't be surprised if the framers themselves are all rolling in their graves over the same thing.
Yeah, James Madison said that, you know, that he deplored the vicious arts by which elections are carried. I think he would see the vicious arts in full swing if he were alive today.
Yeah, no doubt. Hey, the great civil rights leader Julian Bond passed away recently, and a lot of people don't know that his contested election to the Georgia State Senate resulted in a landmark Supreme Court decision. Tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, well, in 1966, Bond was elected to the Georgia General Assembly from a majority black district after the Voting Rights Act was put in place so that blacks were allowed to vote. And when he showed up to take the oath, one of the old line power brokers, a gentleman named Jim Sloppy Floyd, made a motion that he be excluded. And the reason was that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, of which he was a founding member, had issued a statement saying, we don't support the war in Vietnam. A country that doesn't give justice to people of color at home can't be trusted to do justice to people of color abroad. And we offer our support to African-American young men who are considering refusing the draft. And Bond was not part of issuing that statement, but subsequently he said he approved it and that he admired the conviction of people who were willing to defy the draft because they didn't want to kill. And Mr. Sloppy Floyd said that that meant he didn't support the U.S. Constitution and that it was the prerogative of the Georgia legislature to exclude unpatriotic people because they wouldn't be true to their oath. And the governor of Georgia declared Bond's seat vacant. He said that he has been removed from office. And so there was a special election, and the voters of his district elected Julian Bond again. He came back, and once again they refused to let him take the oath. And by this point, the case reached the United States Supreme Court, which unanimously said, there is no possible constitutional way that a state government can tell elected officials, state or federal, what issues they can discuss or what positions they can take. This is the whole essence of representative government. It was an important step in the whole Warren Court project of dismantling these little petty dictatorships that had grown up in the segregated states. The Georgia under the Talmadges, Mississippi under Bilbo and Vardaman and so forth, where really there was no political competition and there was no freedom of speech. And the wonderful thing about Bond's life is that, he did so much to bring freedom for all of us that when he died, this landmark case in front of the Supreme Court really was about one paragraph in long obituaries, because it was just one thing he did, but it was tremendously important.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and as you say, of so many great things. Garrett Epps, legal scholar, novelist, journalist, professor of law and creative writing at the University of Baltimore, joining us on americasdemocrats.org today. Garrett, thank you so much for your time. We do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Enjoyed it.
Quite well, we enjoyed having you with us. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. 50 summers ago, the Watts riot in Los Angeles brought to light the shame of urban ghettos. Housing expert Andre Shashaty explains how voters and the government prevented African Americans from making economic gains. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Inequality is not a condition, it's a creation. It's produced by thousands of decisions deliberately made by bosses, bankers, and big shots to siphon money and power from the many to the few. We see Wall Street and Washington doing this to us, but the widening and deepening chasm of inequality in America is also the product of decisions that local elites are making every day. Take Grand Rapids, Michigan, a city largely run by a few billionaire families sharing an entrenched laissez-faire ideology. They want no heavy-handed government policies, unless you're poor or working class. Thus, the city powers who find it unconscionable to hike taxes on the rich recently socked low-income bus riders with a 17% jump in fares. For the 27% of the people in Grand Rapids who live below the poverty line, that's a serious chunk of change siphoned right out of their pockets. Then, the board of directors of the city's transit agency slipped a siphon tube into the wallets of their own drivers and mechanics, arbitrarily terminating their pensions. Adding a crude insult to injury, the board simultaneously gave a pay raise to the transit boss, literally stealing from workers to lift the CEO's salary above $200,000 a year. When the workers, who were members of the Amalgamated Transit Union, began leafleting bus riders to oppose the fare hike and pension theft, the arrogant boss and autocratic board threatened to arrest and fire them. This is Jim Hightower saying, luckily, even in Grand Rapids, it's still illegal to exercise your First Amendment rights, so the union won an injunction against this repression. Better yet, the attempted siphoning of money and power has rallied community groups, students, bus riders, and others into a grassroots movement to stop widening the inequality gap and start bridging it.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. In the 50 years since the Watts riot, there was only a brief period of time when government actually tried to end housing discrimination. And one of those who tried to help was named Romney. Hear the story from housing expert Andre Shashaty. And we say hello to Andre Shashaty, president of the nonprofit Partnership for Sustainable Communities and author of a new book, Masters of Inequality, 50 Years After Our Cities Burned, Why American Society is Still So Divided, and What We Must Do Now to Avoid Chronic Conflict. Andre Shashaty, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's fantastic to participate with you, and I'm really glad that you've shown an interest in this material because it's tough stuff, and not a lot of people are willing to engage in it.
Absolutely. And in fact, 50 years ago, the country saw urban violence break out in Los Angeles, ushering in several years of long, hot summers. You say a large reason for racial segregation in housing. What was the connection?
Well, let's look at Los Angeles to give you a concrete example. The black population of Los Angeles in 1965 had just learned that in the previous election, the state legislature's efforts to promote fair housing were overturned by the voters by a margin of 2 million votes. In other words, the state legislature had enacted a law banning discrimination housing. You could not refuse to rent to a black person or a black family because of their race. There was outrage in the real estate industry, and a referendum was put on the ballot. And the referendum said, let's repeal that because it's our right to discriminate as Californians. We have the right to discriminate against black people and Hispanic people, of course. And it passed. The fair housing law was repealed by a margin of 2 million votes. And that's just a dramatic illustration of what was going on in major cities throughout the West and the North as the Great Migration had progressed. Black families were basically confined in small areas, and these became known as the black ghettos. They had terrible services. They were completely segregated. People could not get out, no matter how much money they made. The sanitation was bad. There were rats. The housing conditions were bad. There was economic exploitation. The list goes on and on and on. And of course, that was not well received by the people that lived there. There was anger. There was frustration. And then you factor in the political situations where the ability to advance politically and gain political power was non-existent in many of these cities. And, it added up to a very volatile situation.
I mean, how much have things changed? I mean, where are the success stories and the failures right now?
Well, things have changed, but slowly, and at a very high price to taxpayers because it does cost money to improve inner cities. But there are success stories. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has financed the development of millions of units of housing and done many things to advance fair housing. They've tried. But so there have been successes. They're not well reported. They're not well publicized. They're not really very interesting to the general public. But they're out there. The public housing program is in much better health than it was many years ago. Some of the worst public housing has been converted to some of the neighborhoods with the most promise to encourage integration and economic opportunity for lower-income people. So there's plenty of success stories, but the biggest failure is that the government has never figured out how to encourage private development of affordable housing in suburban communities, primarily suburban communities, but also smaller towns, where people of all incomes can live together because they can all find some kind of housing they can afford. And the problem is that exclusionary land use policies have held sway and have never really been effectively challenged by state or federal governments. They try around the edges, but the suburban governments and the small town governments have always gotten their way, basically, in being able to keep out affordable housing, maintaining exclusivity, and by extension, maintaining a fairly rigid system of separation. I won't use the word segregation because it upsets some people, but separation, that only the more affluent people can get into those communities, and by virtue of demographics and the reality of income disparities, that's mostly going to be white people.
We were speaking with Andre Shashaty, president of the nonprofit Partnership for Sustainable Communities, author of a new book, Masters of Inequality. The Kerner Commission, Andre, that investigated the causes of rioting in the 60s, called for, among other things, a huge federal commitment to promote affordable housing. Have we really seen it, or are we ever going to really see that?
Well, it actually did happen for a very short period of time. What very few people know, except people who have studied the history like me, is that for a brief period in the 60s, there was a great deal of concern in Congress. There were multiple hearings going on with prominent senators going around the country to hold hearings on what was wrong with the cities. People were shaken up by the riots that occurred from 65 to 68, shaken very badly. And there was a great deal of effort. One presidential candidate traveled to 17 cities to visit the ghettos to see what was wrong in those places. It happened to be a man named Romney, but it was Mitt Romney's father, George. And he made it a point to try to understand what was going on. Mind you, a Republican. But that flurry of activity really depended on Lyndon Johnson, Martin Luther King Jr., and to some degree Robert F. Kennedy. Johnson retired, and the other two people were shot and killed. And the chances to continue that level of activity and that political effort sank pretty quickly in the spring of 68, and Richard Nixon was elected in 68, and he was followed by people like Ronald Reagan, and not as president, but as Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, all of whom continued the fight against the programs that Johnson stood for. And the opponents have been very successful since the Nixon era in stifling these programs and cutting them and in eliminating many of them.
You know, the term white flight describes the abandoning of cities by whites to the suburbs. Why did it happen, and what's been the effect?
Well, it happened because as governments started to enact fair housing laws and started to pressure property owners to accept integration of housing, people voted with their feet and they left the inner cities, and they established white communities with, zoning and land use laws that pretty much ensured that no one was going to build low-cost housing. So if you were white and you could afford it, you moved out of town, and you got help from the federal highway program and the federal mortgage insurance program because they were building the freeways that let you move out of town and still commute to the downtown jobs, and they financed the mortgages in communities that were all white, and in fact they encouraged the real estate industry to keep them all white. So that caused a tremendous outflow of people with money from the cities, and the cities suffered financially as a result. And I personally believe that they've suffered from those the loss of those taxpayers and those and the job creation that also left town and went to the suburbs. They've suffered from it for most of the last 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Now, what do you make of the trend of prosperous younger folks moving back into some central cities? Are cities changing for the better in this new non-industrial economy?
Well, some cities are. The movement has great potential, and it has benefited some cities greatly, but its importance has been exaggerated on an aggregate basis. It has to be kept in mind that that's a great promotional story for real estate developers and real estate writers, They love to tell that story because it increases property values in areas that are starting to see some gentrification. It's also great political propaganda for those who oppose government spending to help the cities. There are a number of academics who are producing studies and books that say cities are great, everything's fantastic, they couldn't be better. Well, the subtext is we don't need to spend money to help the cities and the poor city dwellers. So you have to look at where the information's coming from. It's very hard to generalize. You have to look at each city's experience. And it's important to keep in mind that where it is happening, and it is happening in Boston and San Francisco to a very large extent, it has a negative side effect. It drives up rents and home prices so much that many people who've lived in those neighborhoods for years can't live there anymore. And so it's definitely a mixed blessing where it is happening, and it's certainly not happening everywhere.
Is it a couple steps forward, one step back kind of process right now?
Yes, absolutely. It's hard to harness the economic power of that gentrification without seeing the displacement of lower income people. So you have the cities that can manage it well are few, the leaders that can manage it well are few, and if we have continuing attacks on the programs that HUD operates and budget cuts, there aren't going to be as many tools coming from the federal government to help locals deal with it. Yeah.
Is there some hope because the gentrifiers are also more committed to social, economic, and racial justice?
Well, that's a very, very loaded question. The people that can afford the $1 million condos, maybe they have some greater social consciousness at some level in some way, but if they buy $1 million condo in a place that was gentrified and in a piece of land that used to house working class people, I'm not sure what they may be thinking. In theory, is that relevant? Hopefully, the millennial generation as a whole, including all those who can't buy a $1 million condo, are the force for change. That's about as much as I could say on that.
Okay. Andre Shashaty, president of the nonprofit Partnership for Sustainable Communities, author of a new book, Masters of Inequality. Andre, thank you so very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
It was my pleasure.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, nuclear arms expert Joe Cirincione.
It's a big day around the Bill Press show because he is back from a trip to Israel to the West Bank. First-hand report from Joe Cirincione, head of the Plowshares Fund. Hello, Joe. We missed you. Welcome back.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be back.
And this is a good week. You got to be back this week because, well, we're supposed to have a big vote this week. I don't know what's going to happen.
We're very, very close to victory. Very close to pushing the Iran agreement over the finish line.
Looks good.
It looks very good. It's actually unstoppable at this point. It's just a question of how foolish the Republicans want to make themselves look as they try to derail it.
They are starting out making themselves
doing a pretty good job.
They are indeed. First, let's go a quick hello to Peter Ogburn and Jamie Benson, our team here.
Hello.
Happy Thursday. Team completed by Ray Rogers on the phones here to take your calls at 866-55-PRESS and videographer Cyprian Bolding. You're talking about making fools of themselves. A lot of them did yesterday. It was like the clown car or the clown bus, we have to say these days.
I thought the same analogy.
Unloaded on the steps of the United States Capitol with the big anti-deal rally. Donald Trump, Glenn Beck, Ted Cruz, Phil Robertson, and the star of the show was Sarah Palin, who made, Joe, I thought, the most cogent...
Oh, this is a setup.
No.
But go ahead. Don't let me ruin it.
No. The most cogent argument against the Iran nuclear deal, okay? All right. Here she is. This is what's wrong with the deal.
Only in an Orwellian Obama world full of sprinkly fairy dust blown from atop his unicorn as he's peeking through a really pretty pink kaleidoscope would he ever see victory or safety for America or Israel in this treaty.
First of all, what's wrong with pink? She was wearing a pink blouse when she said this. But
Sprinkly fairy dust from his unicorn as he's looking through the pink kaleidoscope.
It is poetry. It's poetry.
Poetry.
You talk a lot about
spoken
foreign policy.
word.
We see you on TV all the time. Next time you go on a show, you can use that. I want you to talk about pretty pink unicorns and rainbows and kaleidoscopes.
I'm going to go find a pink kaleidoscope.
There you go.
And I will bring it. They asked me a question. Well, let me take a look first. Now it's clear.
Some
Now I
people look
see
into a
the
crystal
answer.
ball. Some people look into a pink kaleidoscope.
Oh God!
From atop their unicorn with fairy dust.
Man, I defy anybody to watch any video they want of that event yesterday and not come away with the view that these people are completely bonkers.
Yeah.
I mean, it was one nutty talk after another, and I got to admit, Sarah did with the cherry on top of the cake. That was quite something.
She took it right. I want to know who paid her to come all the way from Alaska for that.
And just remember, she was almost our vice president. Right?
Yeah.
John McCain picked her to be on the ticket.
Thank you, John McCain. Right. Things really, over the summer, have turned around on this Iran deal. Joe,
Yes.
you've been in talking about how it's tough. We're really working to get enough Democratic votes, so if the president has to veto it, we can sustain the veto. Math has changed, hasn't it?
It's unbelievable, actually. The support for this deal has just grown steadily with major figures coming out in favor for it. Well, number one, it's a really good deal. I mean, I know everything you've heard, and if you just watch Congress, you would think this was a deal somewhere between catastrophically bad and barely good enough. But in fact, this is a very good deal. This is going to stop Iran from getting a bomb for at least 15 years, and probably much longer than that, and it sets a new standard for the kinds of inspections and monitoring we can expect of any country. I hope this model is applied to other countries besides Iran. So that's number one. Number two, it's because Obama did a great job in pushing it. This was his number one priority, and he worked the phones himself. Even when he was on Martha's Vineyard on vacation, he was calling members, talking to them personally. And the more members heard about it, the more briefings they got. They got to see the classified briefings. They became convinced. And third, I think, is that, frankly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the outside game. The non-government organizations rallied around this. We weren't going to sit back and let AIPAC and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy and Bill Kristol and the Weekly Standard kill this chance for a diplomatic solution and try to trick us into a new war. And people stood up. So this August, instead of having town halls where you were besieged with people criticizing the plan, members had town halls where the supporters of the plan outnumbered the opponents, and that gave them the kind of political courage, the political cover to come out and support. And you're seeing now more and more members come out and support even this week.
I know this is even delicate to raise, but I have never seen a debate on any issue where the leader of a foreign country stepped in, and it seemed that there were some members of Congress who were more interested in what Bibi Netanyahu had to say about this deal than President Obama.
It is delicate because every time you raise it, you get accused of anti-Semitism. And I know this because I get accused of anti-Semitism.
I have too on my entire career.
For saying that there's something wrong when Israel appears to have a veto over U.S. national security policy. If this was the leader of any other country, we would be outraged that they were intervening in our affairs to this extent.
And by the way, if I can criticize President Obama, I can criticize Bibi Netanyahu. I'm sorry. And I've been to Israel. You just got back. I was blown away by the criticism of whoever, I forget who was the prime minister at that time.
You should hear what they call Bibi at the there.
Yeah, if you read the Israeli press,
any prime minister,
are wicked.
They rip him apart.
They rip him apart, right. And then if we say something critical, he's an anti-Semite.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, right?
Yeah.
I think the guy is dead wrong.
Yeah.
He has proven it. He's been predicting that Iran had a nuclear bomb for the last 15 years or so. Right?
Yes, that's right.
They're going to have one tomorrow.
He's run on this, and this is part. Well, we're getting a little off here, but this is part of his effort to securitize the whole political discussion in Israel, so that there's an existential threat from Iran, and so you need a strong man like Benjamin Netanyahu to do it. And the more you talk about Iran, the less you have to talk about the economy, which is in trouble in Israel, and then of course you don't have to talk about the Palestinians at all. So this works for him politically, and then he brings it over here to accomplish the same purposes, relieve U.S. pressure on him to do something about the occupation.
So we'll go through, you did mention that the Republicans are in such disarray over this, right?
Yeah.
So now they know they've lost, but they don't know how to deal with it, right?
So just yesterday, I mean, while this circus is going on the west front of the Capitol, which, by the way, Trump said we're going to have a massive crowd. There were more cameras than audience there. And I haven't really seen this in the press. Neither the Washington Post nor the New York Times talked about this. There were maybe 200 people, maybe 300.
Right.
There was more press than observers. So this was a fizzle, a flop. For the megastars of the far right, this is all they could muster, a real clown show. But the real drama was happening inside, where there was a revolt against the Republican leadership, because they were planning to have a procedure to a vote on a bill on Friday, and the rank and file they didn't want to have a vote. They wanted this crazy new idea that the president hasn't followed the terms of the agreed procedures, and that the whole thing should be scuttled, and there should be no vote at all.
Right, and that bunch of extreme conservatives managed to derail the entire process.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So Boehner once again lost control of his caucus.
And now there's chaos in the House ranks, and so it looks like they're going to have a different piece of legislation that they may or may not bring up on Friday that's going to be different from the Senate legislation. So it's unclear whether the Republicans are going to be able to do anything on this bill.
On another front, Josh Earnest telling us at White House the other day that the United States, the administration is reviewing our policy of how many refugees from Syria we should accept here in the United States. So it's not just a problem in Europe, it's worldwide.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Garrett Epps, Andre Shashaty, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the show and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.